Good evening, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host. It's been a long time of the Politically Homeless podcast. And with me is a guest who is also very much politically homeless. His name is Rojas. He is the writer for Compact Magazine and American Affairs, two publications that I either read or subscribe to. I'm actually a new subscriber to Compact Magazine, and happy to support them. They have some very thought-provoking articles are written by a variety of authors. Um, Juan is a intelligence analyst, and he has quite a few heterodox opinions. He knows personally and has worked with various writers that I've quoted on this show, like Sohrab Ahmari and Julius Krein of American Affairs. Sohrab Ahmari is the founder, I believe, editor of Compact Magazine. He is also a rather prolific author and columnist of the book Tyranny Incorporated. Um, and Juan is also a native Floridian. He is from South Florida. Go Florida. And in this first segment of the program, and I hope Juan will be a regular guest in the future, but today we're going to talk about the realignment between shades of the left and the right. And Juan, if you'd like to tell us more about your professional background before we go into your political evolution, where you started, and our discussion on the realignment. And again, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Nevin. With regards to my professional background, I am actually, okay, professionally, I guess I'm only recently starting. I'm currently working as an intelligence analyst, or it's funny because our formal titles used to be intelligence analysts, which that's what we currently do, but now they changed it to associate consultants, whatever. But anyway, I work for a global security company that provides all sort of advice and security consulting research for companies that work in conflict and areas or areas of high crime, both here in the United States and abroad. Before that, I actually worked as a social worker in the immigration sector for around a year. And before then, essentially, I guess I was in academia for a long time. I don't have a PhD or anything like that, but I got a bachelor's and a master's from the University of Florida. I had a funny little job for around a year where I worked in Medellin, Colombia, with a professor of mine from the University of Florida on a research project on community policing. Very cool job. Saw a lot of good, bad, and ugly. And I like that kind of work. I like being out there. I don't just like sitting at a desk all the time, which is funny because what I do now. But it's certainly in my area of expertise. I'm a Latin Americanist. So I was actually born in Colombia, in Bogota, and my parents came here to the U.S., to South Florida at a very young age. I was raised in Coral Springs, of all places. Go figure. It's certainly a small world. Now I live in Plantation, Florida, which is very nearby. I was living in Doral and Miami-Dade before then. My parents now live in Boca Raton. But what else? I studied Latin American studies for my master's. Throughout my childhood, traveled a lot to Colombia, and I've always felt a close connection to the region and my country of birth. Being here in South Florida, obviously there are a lot of people of Latin American descent, particularly Cuban Americans. But also Colombian Americans is quite a number as well. Oh, yes. South Americans too. So that's kind of my background. Politically, I guess that's another story, but I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, no, I apologize for the interjection. Just so for the viewers, I will say, perhaps foolishly, but it is public knowledge, it's public record. I live in Coral Springs now. I'm from New York originally, grew up in Long Island, and went
Oh,
to the State University of New York at Albany and received a double major in history and political science. Wrote my senior honors thesis on Nazi, the theory and practice of Nazi anti-capitalism. Moved down to Florida in 1997. I have family down here. Got my first master's in social science curriculum instruction. Wanted to become a professor at a high school teacher, and then I transitioned to library work, where I started to work for the Broward County Libraries in 1998. And I've been working for the Broward County Library System ever since then, and now I'm branch manager at one of the local branches in Broward County Libraries, and enjoy it thoroughly. And you get to work very closely with customers from varying walks of life. It's one of the many things that help inform my views about people and even politics and economics, uh, other than my own other life experiences as well as research. And I've changed my views and adjusted my views over the years. I mean, I still have core principles, but there are some issues that I've radically transitioned on, and perhaps we can kind of open that up. Before I summarize my beliefs, I think the audience really would like to hear where you're coming from. Did you start as a person on the right or the left, or were you always sort of politically homeless? And do you work in any campaigns? So tell us about your political evolution journey, please.
sure, sure. I always had more of a left-wing background, not like Marxist or far left or anything like that. But naively or correctly, I've always had the position that broadly the policies that most help the common man are the ones that governments should pursue. But funnily enough, yeah, that's always affected my political evolution. Presently, I consider myself to be nonpartisan. That doesn't mean I'm non-ideological. I still have a very specific ideology. But I don't like the horse race politics. I despise both parties, and I think they both have different and contrasting problems. And over time, yeah, my political evolution has led me to recognize, I think rightly, that both sides have policies that do favor the average person and benefit the country. I guess it's funny, I've always been something of a contrarian. I described my evolution in another podcast. When I went to university, that ironically moved me more to the right or towards the center. I've always had more left-wing views on economics, and that's more or less unchanged. Although I can make some precisions in there. But more or less, I've always had similar ideas on economics. Where going to university, my opinion changed a bit more, was on the social cultural issues. That today I would consider myself to be more centrist or even center right. So yeah, it's kind of a funny evolution. And on more consequential things, I talked to Peter Ryan, who has an excellent podcast, Ryan Research. It's funny. Yeah, I have reassessed a lot of former views that I had, for instance, on free trade. Different issues like free trade and immigration, I was kind of agnostic. For a time, yeah, I accepted the traditional center-left position, but wasn't really married to it. And that kind of led me to reassess certain things, similarly on energy policy. And, like 10, 15 years ago, it's funny, in like Democratic circles, you'd hear arguments like, oh, free trade is bad, think about all the people in China that are being exploited, and this is just casino capitalism. There needs to be some controls, there needs to be some regulations. And funnily enough, somewhere down the line, a lot of that got lost. where then it suddenly started to be Republicans making some of those arguments and Democrats saying that no, free trade benefits everyone, and there are the negative externalities, if there are any, it's really minor. Same thing with immigration. And so, yeah, you realize that some of these positions are a bit odd. The argument against immigration is that there needs to be some controls. Well, within domestic economics, that's the argument that Democrats make regarding, regulations towards finance and in anything else. I mean, if you just leave people free to do anything they want, a lot of people, even if it's a few, will abuse the system. And so there needs to be some controls. Similarly with immigration, there needs to be some control. You can't have people coming in unrestricted, and there needs to be a process, a logical system, and that's something we really don't have in the U.S. It's just kind of anarchy. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, the same logic goes to free trade. Trump, unfortunately, really put everything on its head by always embracing a more protectionist stance, and out of just mindless partisanship, so many Democrats now move to the free trade position, which is funny because Biden has been far more protectionist than Trump ever was. So it really has built on that, on what Trump, the baseline that Trump set out. But if you look at polls, actually Democrats are now far more favorable towards free trade, something like 70% support free trade, than Republicans, who favor more protectionist measures, tariffs and the like. So I guess I'll leave it there for now.
I've noticed that too. I think it depends. I think you make a lot of good points. I mean, just to, answer a few points, I've noticed that too. You look at the evolution of one of the podcasters who's almost 2 million subscribers, David Pakman. And before Trump, he was actually very much a critic of free trade, and there are YouTube videos available. And since Trump became president, it really took a verbal position against free trade. Pakman kind of switched his rhetoric and sounded almost like a libertarian in one of his podcasts, which is unfortunate. And that was the issue on Russia too, as well, is the Democrats that, for the most part, and I've written about this for Active Media and America's Survival, that it was many of the Democrats in the Obama administration rhetorically that were for a reset with Russia, signing START II treaty and permanent normal relations with Putin's Russia, the Russian Federation, in 2012. And the Republicans rhetorically were more suspicious of the intentions of the Russian Federation. Now,
now that's flipped. The mindless partisanship is something that drives me completely insane. But
So, and
I should add one more thing that, and it's just me being honest. And I mentioned going to university. I definitely what caused me to really reevaluate a lot of these things was unfortunately the identity politics. And just going through university right at the time of the so-called Great Awakening. I went to UF first in 2014, graduated in 2018 with my bachelor's, and this is just the point where you see all the kooky stuff, and I mean the average university student is not as insane as conservative outlets will make out, but that definitely does exist. And that kind of rhetoric and arguments that you hear even from professors, it just got to a point where I found it to be untenable and ridiculous. So
I mean, and you brought up a lot of good points. I don't particularly like partisan politics either. That's why I call this show the Politically Homeless Podcast. There are beliefs that I have that are shades of right and maybe moderate left by today's standards. I would argue that their populist policies or moderately statist policies in the economy and politics are better suited to achieve what I would consider laudable conservative goals like strong nuclear families, a strong
Absolutely, yeah.
sense, and a strong economy of what I term shared but earned prosperity. Now, when it comes to identity politics or the cultural issues, I think part of that is driven by declining economic standards. I think we would have reduced crime, reduced abortion and whatnot, and this is confirmed by studies, if we abandon neoliberal or trickle-down economics or Reaganomics and extreme globalism.
Absolutely, yeah. We'd probably see a lot less infighting from these cultural issues. They would be less salient, I think.
Yeah, so I look at that and I also feel, and this is where I have more center-left views, I feel that we can have what I would term a pluralism of lifestyles where you can have the integrity of the nuclear family maintained, but it can coexist with people that are also LGBTQ plus couples and people adopting as kids as long as they're mentally sound, fit, have steady, secure forms of income and whatnot. So I believe you can have both of the pluralism of lifestyles obviously coexisting side by side. Now, there are certain lifestyles that to most of the audience and you and I that are wholly unacceptable. Obviously, I mean, pedophilia, whatnot. I mean, lock them up and throw the key away, or even worse, as far as I'm concerned. And I say that also as a father of an 18-year-old daughter. But, my issue, and I think you brought a point about leftism, I think part of the problem, and I come from the right politically, and I've been active with some candidates, volunteering, for Lieutenant Colonel Allen West years ago when I thought he was be a different type of Republican. Mike Lemire, who had some populist tendencies, he ran in a state Senate Republican primary against the incumbent at the time, Ellen Bogdanoff, who's one of your more plutocratic Republicans in Florida, but then again, most of them down here are plutocratic and older.
The Democrats are too.
The Democrats are, they're not much better. There are a few good people. There are a few good Republicans in Florida that used to exist that were independent, like Alex Villalobos and Paula Dockery, Mike Fasano a little bit, but those they're all retired or were pushed out of the Republican Party. Villalobos actually, Jeb Bush actually kind of basically not literally had a hit on him, but politically forced him out of the Republican Party years and years ago because he didn't support the Jeb Bush education agenda. But, I digress. So, I look at that and I look at the leftist issues. I mean, there are so many, when I look at politics, the American political landscape, there are so many shades and slivers of left and right. And I wanted to read, I'm sure you're familiar with James Burnham. And he wrote in a very good book called The Coming Defeat of Communism, which was published in 1950. And he wrote, quote, very many businessmen do not know the difference between a communist and an anarchist, democratic socialist, or mere eccentric dissident. They pick up a pompous phrase like socialism is the halfway house to communism, and imagine that by repeating it, they are being profoundly philosophical. And even though he was a staunch anti-communist, as you know, and when I was reading that book, I thought, man, this is would be so unwelcome in today's political climate of right-wing politics, but here you have somebody with nuance using that. And one of the things that I find in both elements of the left and especially the right, coming from the right, is this extreme form of ideological tribalism. I think there is an allergic reaction to facts, if you will, even when you try and press like how trickle-down economics is a failure, Reaganism on the economic front and political front is a failure, fusionism needs to be ditched, basically. And while the goals of conservatism are, in my opinion, are awesome, like more entrepreneurialism, getting rich, strong family values, strong
family, they're noble goals.
Yeah, they're all laudable goals that I really like. But the problem is, in my estimation, and here in Florida is a perfect example, and I love this state, the numbers are just not adding up. And I put two and two together and I'm like, Now you're probably wondering what caused me to really get disillusioned with modern conservatism or fusionism. And there is a fellow who I interview. He's a frequent guest. Everyone knows who he is, those listeners out there. And his name is Jared Nyquist. And on the Russia-China issue and foreign policy, to a large degree, I more or less agree with him. We have some disagreements on domestic issues. I would say I'm more, quote, to the left of him comparatively. He had this interview, I just want to read it. And I've encountered this a little bit with some of my political activism too, brushed up against it in a much more mild way. But I think it's very telling. And it caused me, along with many other pieces of evidence and research, to really think that, and I want to use a term loosely, that capitalism, or at least this sort of globalized, financialized capitalism that operates more on the ethics of Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and Jack Welch rather than the old school industrialists and the old school conservative bankers. That caused me to say, you know what? I say this very loosely, capitalism, because I support a form of capitalism and free enterprise, but not what has been existing in this country for 40 years. So this is an April 2020 interview with Jared Nyquist on a podcast. And he said he used to write for Newsmax and WorldNet Daily back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. He wrote a book called Origins of the Fourth World War, which is a very interesting read. I recommend the book. And he writes, it's all about the Russia-China threat. And that's what he wrote at the time about Newsmax and WorldNet Daily. I remember reading it back then, and they were well-documented, well-reasoned articles, I felt at the time. So I said I leave Newsmax because Chris Ruddy, who was the founder, and I think he's still the editor there and runs it, has decided that he doesn't want to promote what I'm talking about, meaning the Russia-China threat. And in fact, his financial backers want me to stop because I have this meeting with the main political advisor to a billionaire, and I know who it is, but I'm not going to violate confidence, who tells me, quote, you have to stop promoting this book, The Origins of the Fourth World War, about the Russia-China threat. And you have to stop doing this because the financial and industrial elite will never understand this, and the only way we can defend America against its adversaries. He says, I know you're right. I'm fishing buddies with Ladislav Bittman, who worked as the assistant chief of the Czechoslovakian Intelligence Disinformation Department. He says he knows the collapse of the USSR was fake, and we could dispute that, but I'm just reading the quote to give the audience and you kind of the flavor of where the conversation is going. He says he knows the collapse of the USSR was fake. I know the collapse is fake, but we can't convince them, anybody, because the financial elite wants to invest in Russia and China, and they want to go everywhere, and the only way we can defend the country is we have to get ballistic missile defense, which we don't have enough of, and then we're going to be good. Now, here's another one that's a shorter quote, because I think it's important that the viewers, and I'm sure the Compact viewers may listen to this, and my viewers are going to listen to this. Let's see here. So here's a couple of other things, and I think most people will understand that this is a problem. So when a loan was dispersed to communist Bulgaria, Daniel Davidson, the head of the London branch to the Morgan Guarantee Bank, an American company, nonchalantly noted, for all we know, they may be buying uranium with it. And then when fears were expressed that a $700 million loan dispersed by the First Chicago National Bank to the USSR would finance Moscow's intercontinental ballistic missile modernization program, a representative of the bank responded, it could, of course, be used for the missiles, but we hope not. We can't control that. And when I start to read that, and 1,001 other quotes by former hedge fund traders that, like Sam Polk, who wrote a tell-all article about him and his hedge fund colleagues and CEOs were giant fireballs of greed that can basically have all the politicians, mayor in New York City and others like putty in their hands. I realized that, no, it's not a conspiracy like some of the Alex Jones people will say, for example. It's not that capitalists are wonderful and we should worship them and give them every benefit under the sun. Well, what I learned, like you and Sarab Amari and others, is that when you have unchecked power, not only in the government, but unchecked power in the private sector, this, I started to connect the dots and view this as a threat to our national security and our very existence as a nation and the fundamental stability of capitalism. So that's my political evolution in a nutshell. And I found, to be quite honest with you, that I have better conversations on economics with moderate leftists than I do with the staunch advocates of Reaganomics and libertarianism. Where I differ from neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, and communists and actual real socialists is I believe in capitalism. I believe in private enterprise, but the critiques expressed by the left and collectivists of the current system of capitalism is more closer to the truth than the libertarians and the Reaganomics crowds that say, that capitalism is wonderful and it always is self-regulated and will achieve the most optimum results for everyone if left uncontrolled. The other part is also I started to read some of the quotes by various trickle-down economics advocates and libertarians and Reaganomics types. And there's also a lot of callous cruelty to people that are frankly vulnerable and who individually don't have power. And that really rubbed me the wrong way. When I was younger, I was bullied. I did stand up for myself one time. But I know what it's like to be bullied because you're perceived as being, quote, the weaker kid. And I don't want to see that for society. There are many good people out there that are everyday Americans that need a break a little bit. They need to earn truly the fruits of their labor because that means more money into the American economy. That means their morale is at a certain level where, God forbid, for example, we have to fight a war, then they would be willing to serve. Now the polls on the approval ratings for Congress, the Supreme Court, big business is in the toilet and has been for a very long time. So if we have to fight a war, I have a lot of concerns. So there's a national security. And that's how I started to absorb these, if you want to call left-wing critiques. It was from my, quote, right-wing concerns of national security that, like, wait a minute. The neocons, the Reaganites, the libertarians, here they want to fight wars on imported parts, basically, because many of them are advocates of free trade. And they really don't care about the national morale because their view, it's like Ben Shapiro, when he said during COVID, he said, well, if you have to work 2 or 3 jobs, that's a you problem. It's not a system problem.
Yeah. So, or he always says, oh, well, there are jobs, in the cities, just move. Well, I mean, a lot of people don't want to move. They want to live next to their families. They have relatives they need to care for. They have communities that they're attached to. And that's something to be proud of. That's social cohesion. I mean, yeah, it's conservatives that talk about how high church attendance was in the 1950s and all this other kind of stuff. We've been sold this narrative that, the state is the enemy, especially, in right-wing circles. Just get the state out of the way and everything will get better. and well, you just twist yourself into knots that, oh, well, Reagan had the right idea, but he was foiled down the line somewhere, not really sure how. It was the welfare or something. But, just look at the results. I mean, okay, yeah, we started down this line, with Reaganomics, cutting taxes, deregulating and privatizing everything. And Bill Clinton largely continued down the same line. He was the one that said in one of his State of the Unions that the era of big government was over. I guess it was Obama that sabotaged that, or Bush, who knows. But and certainly I wouldn't dispute that I guess the state grew, although I think to me that the whole big government, small government is a little annoying. I care more about an effective government. But sure, the national security state and all of that is. I'm a civic libertarian. I care about my individual liberties in my home. and also individual liberties in general. But it bothers me that, you know, the government is spying on us and all that kind of stuff. But sorry, that was a bit of a tangent.
No, that's fine. I actually agree.
Yeah, but if you look at you know, the purported goals of, you know, like economic libertarians and fiscal conservatives, you know, paying down our debt, cutting deficits, and, you know, free enterprise and prosperity. I guess free enterprise is doing fine, but our national debt has exploded. Yeah, I mean, it's the problem is you create the situation where you can't actually address the goals that you want to pursue. You want people to go to church, but you're telling them, hey, no, just abandon your community, your town that was deindustrialized. Just move and learn to code, and everything will get better. And meanwhile, you know, yeah, the national debt grows out of proportion. It becomes essentially impossible to pay it down because all of the economy has gone into finance and is not an actual real tangible goods. Our manufacturing sector has been devastated. It's gone all to China. So it's, and you know, you just hear this constant hammering, oh, the deficit, the debt, spending, we need to cut spending, we need to cut spending. It's basically impossible. and that's really by design. But so you look at the older tradition that we had in the US, and, you know, I mean, I think you could dispute whether the Republican Party under Lincoln was right or left wing, or the Democratic Party or the Democratic Republicans before them were right or left wing. But both parties had a fundamental understanding that the state is not the enemy. And that doesn't mean that the state is perfect or should be running everything. And that's the mistake of Marxism. The state exists for a reason, and the state should promote investment, should promote industry, should help families, family policy. And yeah, this will get me into trouble with progressives that all praise Viktor Orban's family policies. But yeah, why is it a bad idea to give mothers a stipend if they have more than 2 kids? Especially when you have a declining fertility rate. This just is common sense. Similarly, Glad and Poppin wrote an article about this for Compact, actually. It's like, okay, we have a problem, you know, conservatives have a problem with student loans because whatever, it's just helping Democrats and whatnot. Well, why don't we forgive student loans of indebted persons that get married and have kids? Wouldn't that be good for the nation? So it's really just absurd, and you just compare, you know, libertarian fantasy land with reality. Prior to 1980, we had way larger growth per GDP every year in sectors of the economy that actually mattered. We had way lower rates of debt. We had surpluses. I mean, it's not hard to realize that this is essentially a huge con.
Yeah.
Fiscal libertarianism, I mean.
Right. Yeah, it is. And look, I mean, I also disdain the big versus small government debate. I mean, I'm obviously an opponent of authoritarianism, even totalitarianism, of course, especially when it's expansionist and threatens the United States interests. And I put that asterisk on there on that point. But you know, I agree with Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, and she basically crystallized the point that you just made and I will make. And she talks about how the question is not big or small government, it's who the government works for. She said, It's not a question of more government or less government, it's about who the government works for. Now, concerning the debt, and this is in my book, which I sent you, Turning the Page, My Evolution from Conservatism to Radical Civic Nationalism. And I've seen this too as well in the news. The quote unquote libertarians, and especially more your Beltway Reaganomics types that are part of Conservative Incorporated, they're very hypocritical on the debt. when the Trump administration was passing the tax law, the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, you had a Koch political memo, the Koch brothers, Koch network political memo, which basically stated, ignore revenue neutrality, the tax cuts will produce growth, don't worry about it, everything else. You had Stephen Moore, who was, Mr. Club for Growth and Heritage Foundation, Wall Street Journal, I think, editorial board. I mean, Stephen Moore.
As J.D. Vance called it, the Club for Chinese Growth.
Yes. Yeah, and he downplayed the deficits. He believed that, quote, deficits had, quote, no impact politically. Reagan was running these big deficits, and liberals argued it was Armageddon. Yes, this is Moore saying this. We were going to ruin the economy. Interest rates are going through the roof, and none of these things happened. Brian Riedel of the Heritage Foundation flat out stated, not all debt is bad. Mortgage debt and student loan debt are worthy investments.
That's just saying the quiet part out loud. The reality is the intelligentsia of even the mainstream Republican Party realizes that, sometimes I'm conflicted because, I think that if we move more in the direction of manufacturing and the real economy and promoting, living and higher wages from workers, we would actually see our debt go down and deficits go down, and eventually us go into surpluses from us producing things of value and having a strong, thriving workforce. At the same time, as you just mentioned, the reality is that our national debt continues to go up and up and up. The country hasn't collapsed, and more importantly, we are the source of the world's reserve currency. The limit, if that even exists, for how much we can borrow is probably infinite.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole point of going back to the point of the debt, it's just ridiculous because, okay, we need to cut spending. All right, well, what are the policies that Republicans always go for? First and foremost, tax cuts. Well, that will reduce your revenue. Maybe it'll generate some increased economic growth, but we've seen that it's just really not there to overcompensate for how much you get into debt. And then, of course, Republicans will always boost spending on the military, which I don't even disagree with. But like I said, this is by design. What fiscal conservatives say, and then what they actually do, it makes it impossible to address the stated goal of reducing debts and deficits.
What it is really, and I think it's even something more politically sinister, and that is basically they're going to support the spending priorities of their constituent groups. They're basically their wealthy donors, and they're going to cut programs because they don't believe in any social programs that benefit people, that will even allow them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps to ensure success. But when it comes to, and Democrats are guilty of this too, certainly, particularly the corporate Democrats, and I'm for a very strong national defense. But I'm sorry, I'm also not going to ignore evidence that shows that the Pentagon has failed multiple audits.
Yeah, absolutely. The amount of waste is absurd. I think that honestly, we probably could cut spending on the military, just relocate it into areas where we can actually monitor where all the money is going, and we'd probably have a stronger defense.
And that's what I'm saying. The problem is I can't help but noticing that if the Department of Health and Human Services fails multiple audits, Ted Cruz would be having a hissy fit. Yes, he should be. But also, to me, I see this double standard. Now, one of the first constitutionally mandated responsibilities of the U.S. government is national defense. So the collective national defense or collective defense of our republic. And I agree with that very strongly. There are many things where we don't invest enough money and dollars in that we should have in defense. That's a different discussion unto itself. So when I read these quotes and you have to understand, I think you understand my position. It's like, oh my God, it's like, oh my God, I've been lied to and we've been deceived all along. And I never was really enamored by the hardline left. And a lot of that had to do, I read George Orwell's 1984, and part of it talked about how when Winston Smith was reading Emmanuel Goldstein's The Book, when he talked about English socialism or INGSOC took power, that these were people who, in the name of enlightened progressive values, would justify the shooting of prisoners of war, slave labor camps, everything else, which mirrored Orwell's major issues with the British far left at the time, who were fellow travelers or agents of the Soviet Union, who, like Kingsley Martin, the former editor of, I think it was the New Statesman back when it was more of a hardline pro-Stalinist organ back in the 1930s, he got so sick that he had to relocate seats in their favorite Greek restaurant in London that they would dine in. So I looked at that. I read the former editor of Ramparts magazine, staunch new leftist and red diaper baby, David Horowitz, his two of his articles in Commentary magazine. And it showed me the double standards of the left, of the far left. Groups like the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. This was back when I was in high school. This was my formative years. And the U.S. Peace Council and the Communist Party and the Nuclear Freeze movement are elements of it. And it turned me off that here you had people that considered themselves advocates for social justice, people that were progressive, peace activists, and a large portion of them were like justifying the militarism of what was then the Soviet Union or Cuba or Nicaragua. Now, my height of my anti-communism was I joined the John Birch Society, which is a very hardcore conservative constitutionalist organization. But this is where you have to have some degree of rigorous analysis. And when I started to look at them justifying Somoza of Nicaragua, Batista, Rafael Trujillo, and others in their magazine, American Opinion, they were doing the same silliness that the left was doing, the same political acting as sort of political apologists for right-wing collectivists. And the funny thing is in their scoreboard sections of the old American Opinion magazine, they would take a harder line against social democrats in the West. So when I asked the chapter leader at the time, hey, what's going on? It's like, yeah, they are dictatorships. Yes, the Republic of South Africans and the Afrikaners. Well, their socialism really didn't come from the Afrikaner extreme nationalist position. It was a result of the Labor Party. I'm like, no. When you look at Afrikaner, the history of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, rightfully or wrongfully, they were very anti-capitalist. They were very much against liberal capitalism. I mean, Roger O'Meara, the last name is O'Meara, wrote a book called Volkskapitalisme, and he documents that very well. Others have documented that topic very well too, as well, like Andreas Wassenaar, who is a South African Afrikaner businessman who wrote a book, something called Freeway to Communism, where he talked about the overregulated, hyper-regulated, and state-controlled South African economy in the 1960s and 70s. So I said to myself, look, the heck with this. I didn't join the Birch Society. I learned valuable lessons and information from them. And then, of course, with my political evolution, they're ironically mostly laissez-faire on economics. So it's like I abandoned that. I looked at deindustrialization. I saw how just factories were closing, even in the greater New York City area. And it just, it was like a perfect storm. So I had all these things, and I considered manufacturing to be equivalent of American power. And I was always about maintaining America as a strong, proud country. Emotionally, that was important to me. And I see how groups and think tanks like the Manhattan Institute, they were justifying closures under the size of, they were anti-subsidy of Port Authority of New York and New Jersey facilities like the Red Hook Container Terminal. And this was productive infrastructure that doesn't always have to be profitable, but it needs to be there in case there's an emergency in New York, like 9/11, when boats had to travel to the Battery in southern Manhattan. And what they had to do, apparently, according to the head of a nonprofit, Portside, New York, who I worked with remotely from Florida on research projects, is they had to take blowtorches and go to Battery Park City, and that sort of wrought iron fence around the water, they had to like break it apart so they can evacuate people from southern Manhattan. I mean, this is what's going on. And you have the Manhattan Institute saying, let's just gentrify and close down the ports, close down the industry, because these are crappy neighborhoods, and let's, put up luxury housing and, nice waterfront developments like what we have in Bayfront in downtown Miami or South Street Seaport. And I'm all for having those types of developments, but you have to have, first and foremost, the productive economy, and then everything follows suit. And how I found myself agreeing with the testimony of people like Congressman Gerald Nadler, who's talking about the very same tangible real world views. And I'm like, holy moly, I'm agreeing with the Democrat. And it's like, and I'm like, what in the world is this coming to? But I said to myself, what is more important, political party tribalism and ideology, or what is doing what is provable and right that has contributed to America being the most, at one time, the most powerful nation?
It's called the American system, and the greatest crime in the history of this country is the fact that our indigenous tradition of economics, I don't even want to call it economics. I think that economics in general is a quack science. I prefer political economy. Our indigenous tradition of political economy, dating back to Hamilton and our founders, was that the state would promote investment, industry, and tariffs to build up our productive capacity. And somewhere down the line, mainly in the latter half of the 20th century, the libertarians hijacked the field of economics, essentially erased that tradition, so much so that to this day, in economics departments, and even in political science departments, a lot of people do not even read Hamilton or List or the tradition of thinkers that go back millennia to India and China that developed all of these states.
Yeah, and I think you're right, 100% right. And there's a sinister side to libertarians too. Now, I've met a number of them. I went to a conference because I used to adhere to libertarian economics, and for differing reasons. And I have shared with you privately my.
Yeah, I'll say this: they're not even entirely wrong. Classical economics is correct about a number of things, dumping, supply and demand, all this, the obvious stuff. But they're extremely wrong about a number of key things that they've held up dogmatically that have just destroyed us, like comparative advantage, a notion that just does not make any sense at all. Oh, computer chips, potato chips. What does it matter? Taiwan has a lot of sand. They must have comparative advantage to make semiconductors. No, they built up that industry over decades and now essentially have a monopoly on the most advanced chips. That did not happen through the invisible hand of Adam Smith. That happened through pragmatic, strategic policies cultivated in the long term. And that's something that we just do not do anymore.
Yeah, no, I think, again, when I look at the state, I look at this deeper. I look at the motivations of the ruling group, the ruling party or the majority party and the minority parties. I look at their intentions. I look at their programs. Not all states are created equally. and not all states exist as equal in worth or effectiveness or morality. It's like a hammer. A hammer could be used for good things, for hammering
Mhm.
nails or removing nails. I could also come to your apartment or house and I can take the hammer and hit you
Oh
over the
yeah, you
head.
could kill me with it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I know, I mean, obviously I would never do that. I'm trying to make a joke and make a little something funny, but it's the truth. A state is just a tool. I
Same
am,
thing as the market. The market is a tool. It's not this unstoppable force of nature that is godly and needs to be worshipped. No, it is a tool. It has its uses. It also has its limitations. And in light of that, uh, that's the same reason why going the maximalist Marxist direction just does not work when you're setting the prices for everything, trying to have your mathematical formulas calculating supply and demand, and doing all these arbitrary uh, policies. It leads to disaster.
yeah. Look, compared to a hard leftist and neo-fascist, obviously I'm far, far more libertarian. I even have some libertarian tendencies. Like when it comes to tax policy, my slogan is as low as possible and as high as needed. I don't like to use the tax system for right wing or left wing social engineering necessarily or
Yeah,
economic.
yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, it's funny because if you look before the Reagan or neoliberal revolution or libertarian hijacking to the older tradition of Republicans in the 20th century and going before them. But you look at Nixon, you look at Eisenhower, and they were for a more limited role of the state than Democrats were. That's true. But they did not think of the state as the enemy. And they
Mm.
did not fetishize a lot of these policies the way that current Republicans do. So if you watch the debates between Nixon and Kennedy, both Kennedy, but also Nixon say at one point, I will not commit to cutting taxes if I cannot fulfill that promise and if that policy will have a negative effect on our nation's finances. That is something that, and he says, and if necessary, and we are in the middle of a Cold War, I will raise taxes to meet our commitments. That's something that no Republican today would say.
Well, DeLay, who was in the Congress at the height of the George W. Bush administration, even says during wartime, cutting taxes is actually necessary, is what he said. I think it was in
Hmm.
2007. I think there's also a sinister part of libertarianism, and I have libertarian tendencies, as I even said with the taxes, as low as possible. And you can tell I have that, but I also have a pragmatic side too as well.
Hmm.
For example, in a letter to Ayn Rand about her book, Atlas Shrugged, Ludwig von Mises wrote in a letter, and check this out. Talk about, pardon my language, effed up. You have the courage to tell the masses what no politician told them. You are inferior. And all the improvements in your conditions, meaning the masses, which you simply take for granted, you owe to the effort of men who are better than you. If this be arrogance, as some of your critics observe, it is still the truth that had to be said in this age of the welfare state. Now, when I read this excerpt of the letter on another podcast on Connor's program called Counterpoint. I'm not going to mention his last name because he doesn't give it out. I was mentioning on Counterpoint/Counterfire. I had a libertarian presumably write me saying I dishonestly quoted that. And of course, I wanted to reread it again. And of course, I wasn't just quoting it. He claimed that von Mises was referring to the politicians. No, when you read that, he clearly means the masses. You are telling the masses, quote, hard truths that you're basically worth crap. And when you look at Milton Friedman said sincerity is an overrated virtue. When you have Ayn Rand disciple, and he also had, I think, a romantic relationship with her, and former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, he noted, quote, parasites who persistently avoid either purpose or reason perish as they should. So when you look at this, you look at what our earlier discussion about Ben Shapiro. These people are not conservatives. They are radicals. of a different variety. So you have radical anti-capitalists on one side, like Marxists and neo-Nazi, neo-fascist types, and you have these radicals for an oligarchic form of capitalism on the other. And this is really
That's
what
fundamentally anti-human. I'm friends with Emmett Penny, great writer at American Affairs, Compact as well, The Spectator, and there's awesome guy. He's an expert in energy policy, and he's a huge critic of what he calls anti-humanism, and specifically degrowthers and all of these other mindless ideologies. I mean, libertarianism in general is an anti-human ideology. They fundamentally loathe other people. And I think this is a good segue too. Sadly, in Latin America, market fundamentalism is way stronger than anyone here could ever dream of. Conservatives in Latin America worship, fetishize the market in a way that's frankly disturbing. You see, and unfortunately, in countries like Brazil and now Argentina, there are right-wing candidates, sometimes even for the presidency, that say things like, oh, the poor are just undesirable. It would be better if we could sterilize them. Fujimori did this with a lot of the indigenous population in the countryside because, oh, well, if we have all these poor people, we have to spend more welfare on them. It's better if they just die. And not in vain. Now that the self-described libertarian Javier Milei just won the presidency in Argentina, Vivek Ramaswamy and so many other Republicans, but Vivek notably, he knows his theory a bit better, said, I congratulate President-elect Milei. He has the best wishes of Hayek and von Mises and all of it.
Yeah, he said the spirit of spirit of Hayek and Mises be with you. And look, you and I, there are surface agreements that we have with von Mises and Hayek. There are certain historical points that von Mises had made regarding the quote socialism of Nazism. He wrote about it in his book Omnipotent Government. But as a whole, when you look at the intentions of these scholars and intellectuals, and I read these letters, it really is. They're barbed. They're like touching barbed wire. It's like, ouch. It's like, damn. It's like, whoa, this is not good. And, and we'll talk about Latin America in another segment. And, and we're going to talk more about how this leads into the realignment of which you're a part of. And you should be very proud of yourself of being part of a great budding intellectual tradition. But, you have anti-neoliberal riots that occurred in parts of South America, like Chile, for example, and there were accusations, allegedly, that Cuban and Venezuelan agents or nationals were stirring it up. But whether you and I agree with it or not, the fundamental problem is not addressed. Why these? Why are they occurring? Where is the gasoline coming from that is being poured on there? And I submit it's a problem of the system, because if you not pursue, I'm not saying we should pursue socialism necessarily as properly defined, but if you choose hard-edged neoliberalism, total market fundamentalism, social Darwinism, you're going to create a perfect opportunity for a country like Cuba or Venezuela to take advantage. So a part of me, you can get angry as much as you want about Cuba and Venezuela, but by simply sending the police and just cracking skulls, that's not solving the underlying problems.
This was the fundamental view of Kennedy, and so many, unfortunately, in foreign policy, it was only Kennedy who had this view outside of the U.S. But within the U.S., there was a view that, we need to raise the living standards, raise the wages of workers and of the common man in order to prevent a communist revolution. And in foreign policy, Kennedy specifically had that view. The Alliance for Progress in Latin America was set out precisely to combat the Cuban Revolution. And the idea was we need to foster development in these countries, or else they will turn to communism. And that was very savvy in the sense that okay, how about within the bounds of a capitalist system, you promote development, raise the living standards of the average person who in a country like, let's say, Peru during the 1960s is living in misery. That is the most potent antidote you can have to a communist takeover.
Exactly. No, I mean, and we'll close, well, not the show entirely because we'll talk about the realignment. I'm keeping a sharp eye on the clock because I know we're limited. But as President Kennedy said in 1962, that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And I know this sounds crazy,
Exactly.
but I have fears for that long term in the United States. And there are some signs talk about in my book that I sent you. I know they're very long and have a lot of material, but I try to make a point by deluging the reader with tons of information and evidence and thousands of footnotes to really get people to think. Now, the realignment. We hear in varying quarters, Compact Magazine, Orencast's American Compass, American Affairs. We see some outreach done to some receptive Republican senators, like our senator here in Florida, Marco Rubio. I think I might have to vote for now. At least rhetorically, he's getting better and better on economics.
Yeah. On domestic policy, he's done some very good things.
Yeah. So we have him, at least on the surface. I mean, his voting record is not great like Josh Hawley, but rhetorically, he's moved in our direction. J.D. Vance, somewhat.
J.D. Vance is very good.
You know,
very,
and
very good.
I think I'm missing one or two other people. But we see this development where you're having people on the right and people on the radical center, of which I would consider kind of one of my many intellectual heroes, Michael Lind, and you have people on what I would term kind of the patriotic left. I would consider you, if you even call yourself leftist, I think you're kind of politically homeless, but of the left at one point, like you, all of us coming together and having civil conversations. And I want you to comment on that. Why do you think now the political activists and intellectuals on the left and the right and the center were all fracturing and splintering and having civil and in-depth conversations? I mean, do you think we have common goals and aspirations? I mean, you're more on the inside of the realignment. You've rubbed shoulders with people like Michael Lind, Julius Krein, Sohrab Ahmari, and many others. What is going on here? Tell the viewers, please, what's going on.
Yeah, I ask myself this question sometimes during moments of quiet, I suppose. I mean, if we want to give a sort of assessment or post-mortem, or I guess not post-mortem, but I think that aspirationally, in let's say 10, 15, 20 years time, we might see candidates ideally of both parties running more on this kind of a platform, let's say centrist or center-right, patriotic on questions that regard the nation and social cultural issues, and more left of center on economics. There's progress. There is tangible progress that no one, I think, can deny. As we mentioned before, Biden has largely stuck to Trump's policies with tariffs and has gone way further, promoting domestic industry, the CHIPS Act, the IRA, with local content requirements, subsidies, and the like. You and I have talked about this at length. I mean, you talk about market fundamentalism, let the market do its work. The government can't pick winners and losers. Okay, well, when you apply that policy in practice to areas like shipbuilding or semiconductors, why was it that we lost those industries? We removed subsidies. Our competitors in East Asia were actively subsidizing those industries. So all that industry went over there and we lost it spectacularly. So the fact that there is a realization in both parties around this is tangible. And there's definitely been a realignment in the Democratic Party in that direction, at least in the intelligentsia and the policy field. That's really good. Julius Krein has an excellent essay in American Affairs called "The Other Realignment," and the other in a lot of intellectual circles among Democrats, there's talk about like not supply side economic. I forget what to call it. It's like supply side producerism. It's like, how do you, when you have issues with supply in a particular industry, how do you promote the supply so that you actually meet your goals rather than just cutting taxes? In the Republican camp, yeah, I'll go start with the positives first. You have senators, yeah, like Hawley, Vance, and Rubio that have moved more in that direction and have shown positive signs of bipartisanship. Hawley and Rubio worked with Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal. I think with Jayapal during the pandemic, it was regarding like PPP, although we can get into the weeds about the problems with that. But yeah, there were the stimulus checks and very heartfully, yeah, the sadly went nowhere. J.D. Vance's push towards rail safety after the debacle in East Palestine and a ton of other accidents that occurred around the country in the rail sector. All of that, I think, is really positive. And I think what really undercuts a lot of this is a strategic competition with China. The way I see it, we are effectively in a second Cold War. A lot of people don't really say that outright. I think they should. We are in a great power competition with Russia and its with China and its junior partner Russia. And we are fighting proxy wars just like we did during the 20th century. Look at Ukraine. It can go into that in a little bit. So there is this realization now.
That'll be a whole segment unto itself. Ukraine, China, refugees.
Yeah. But that's definitely changed the mentality in Washington, it seems, towards I mean, you just look at the data. In so many strategic industries, we're behind China: solar panels, rare earth mineral production, electric vehicles, so many other things. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. We need to do something about this. There's just, we have no choice. On the other hand, however, there are still vested interests and sadly such a penchant for market fundamentalism in both parties in specific ways that progress will take a very, very long time. So looking at both sides, on the Republican side, realistically, we're really only talking about 3 senators out of 100. The rest are essentially conventional neoliberal Republicans that have no unorthodox, heterodox views on anything that really matters. And on the other side, in the Democratic Party, okay, we've now embraced industrial policy. And the funny thing is, you can look to voters to see the spectacular failure of this other area: immigration, energy policy, the identity politics. It's made the Democratic Party toxic. And it's something that really they don't seem to be doing anything about. I guess on energy policy, officially now, the Biden administration has authorized more contracts, and our oil production will exceed that under the Trump administration. There are, and this is a partisan football that's horrific. Republicans like to say that it's all, Biden stepped in and overnight gas prices went up. Well, you look at the rest of the world.
No.
Yeah, you look at the rest of the world and gas prices went up all over the world. It's not it's the same thing with inflation. It wasn't just Biden. It's hard for him to just cause this. We were coming out of a pandemic. It's hard to blame Biden for inflation and gas prices in Mexico and in South Africa, but they'll go ahead and do it anyway. But to give them, Yeah. To give them credit, however, throughout Biden's presidency, he has, in attempts to placate the deranged climate change activist sector, canceled a lot of projects that probably would have had us at an even higher degree of production and lowered oil prices. But let's say that that's something more recent, and then voters are certainly not going to care about. On immigration, this is just a complete debacle, which is very sad because, in the past, Democrats were for immigration enforcement, and I mean, they still enforce the law to some degree. The system itself is extremely chaotic, but certainly there is greater and greater antipathy towards essentially enforcing the law, and there are activist sectors that push for an open borders policy and this is just annihilated, like in Europe, much of the electoral prospects of the Democratic Party. Obama deported way more illegal immigrants than Trump did and during his first term. And now what we see is, but yeah, it's not exactly open, I guess. People still do get deported, but we have millions and millions and millions, something like 2 or 3 millions of people coming into this country illegally every year. And we could have debates about this. We've talked privately. I oppose a lot of the maniacal, insane policies towards Cuba that have led so many people to come here. But I guess to close with, because I mentioned 3 things, identity politics with Democrats. The conflict in Israel, Palestine, I guess has put a lot of things on their head, but realistically, a lot of the underlying issues that once the said conflict is over, trans issues and whatnot, and are still going to remain and are going to affect the Democratic Party electorally.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I wanted to circle back because, again, a lot of people don't necessarily, I think they're...
So sorry, one more thing. This is my last interruption.
Yeah, please.
I listed a lot more things for the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. That's not to say that, in my opinion, you could almost argue that there's been more progress from Democrats. I see them as kind of the same, which is to say not much. But just because I didn't list so many things for the Republican Party doesn't mean that their obstacles are not as great, if not greater.
Yeah, I mean, there is some shift in the Republican. I think my experience in the South Florida Republican Party, at least years ago, the realignment has not taken. There were a few REC members, Republican Executive Committee members that I met that were protectionists, and those are people that I supported at the time, protectionists on trade policy and immigration, and a little more open to certain regulatory changes to the American economy. But Florida is generally kind of problematic. But on the other hand, you have Marco Rubio, of course, and I haven't been in Republican campaign politics in many, many years. But I'm also in contact with a fellow who I kind of met through Twitter, who is, I guess, an activist in the Republican Party in Minnesota, where you have in the unionized areas where there's high union representation, there are quite a few Republicans that have more of our views on economy. So
40% of union households voted for Trump, which highest share of the union vote for Republican. And this is, I mean, again, it's only 2 senators, and this is mainstream among Democrats, but it's a huge development. J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley went respectively to the picket lines and backed the UAW strikes. That's excellent, in my opinion, and groundbreaking, to be honest.
Now, concerning energy policy, one of the issues I have, and I think you kind of touched upon it, and this is where I think a lot of our reforms, and you and I think you brought up a good point, and I've said it, I think maybe in one of my interviews with Aaron Nyquist. I'm not sure if I uploaded that one or not, but I am for decoupling from countries like China, Russia, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. Realistically, is you can't affect that overnight. But there are reforms that we can do domestically that can kind of turn the ship away from the iceberg of financialization. And one of the reforms I would pass, and we give it about 5 years to take effect because you don't want to crash the economy. You want to kind of slowly pump the brakes, is making stock buybacks outlaw them.
Exactly. I meant to get to that actually. Yeah.
Industry. Let's read, because a lot of people don't hear this who are conservatives. They're busy listening to the propaganda machine, just like the left, they have their propaganda machine.
Yeah, it's exactly the same.
So despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine and rising gasoline prices, the profits of 13 of the largest oil and gas companies total $46 billion, of which over $27 billion were returned to shareholders through stock buybacks and dividend payments as part of the $65.5 billion in planned payments to shareholders. CEOs all admitted this as due to basically taking advantage of the war in Ukraine. Shell CEO Ben Van Beurden stated, "We talk about share buybacks, maybe change. Well, can I also say that the performance we are seeing this quarter, of course, has been helped by the macro, and the micro has been impacted by the war in Ukraine. We do have a better company. We do have a better performance. And yes, indeed, our shareholders will benefit from that as well." Pioneer Natural Resources CEO Scott Sheffield asserted, "We're not going to change our growth rate. We think it's important to return cash back to shareholders." Pioneer admitted that it cut oil production from a targeted 20% to just 5% in order to return a full 80% of its cash flow back to investors. And I could read more, but you see, again,
I mean, this is just
why I get angry at the right when I see this, and we're being lied to.
They don't talk about this, or if they bring it up, they'll somehow blame it on Biden. I mean, like,
it's not Biden. It's not Biden, for Pete's sake. It's not Biden. The freaking executives are telling us and telegraphing that, and I get mad at this crap.
Yeah, it's completely insane. Look, capitalism 101. When capitalism supposedly works. I mean, this is just a classic example of this is what we call a market failure. And it's the product of how we've enabled financial engineering. The way capitalism should work is that when you make a profit, and the oil and gas sector has seen a huge profit since the war in Ukraine and the end of the pandemic, you should reinvest that money to continue to boost production. And what have these sons of bitches done? They have not done that. They've instead lined their own pockets, or more accurately, lined the pockets of shareholders with buybacks, buying back their own stock. What does that mean? There are insane people that will defend stock buybacks. Oh, well, it's good for the company because the stock price will continue to go up. What does that mean? That's not anything real. That helps no one. That does not help the economy. That is completely insane. This is exactly what I mean, in that we're not focusing on the real economy. Finance is not real. So it's tragic.
Yeah, here, JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon stated to President Biden that, quote, "We need a Marshall Plan for U.S. and European energy security. Today, oil companies are under enormous pressure from Wall Street to return cash to shareholders through dividends and buybacks instead of investing in badly needed supply." There you go. And look, I own stock. I have a nice amount of money that my grandparents on both sides of my family got me. And it's a pretty darn nice cushion I have, and it's one of my whatevers. And I'm not saying that stocks should not do well, but this is a malinvestment of resources. And what's concerning is you have quote unquote conservative propaganda machine. Because remember, they're really not conservatives. The only thing they want to conserve is the aggregated wealth and power of private sector oligarchs. And what they're basically saying here is that it's basically they're lying to us, the people who are on the supposed right that blame Biden solely for this. Well, when you look at the facts, it has nothing to do with Biden. You know, and one of the things that has to happen, we have to restore Glass-Steagall. We have to restore, uh, we have to get rid of stock buybacks, and we have to do
Projects,
it
yeah.
on a gradual basis because by nature I'm kind of conservative and careful. I don't like shocks to the system. We
Hmm.
need
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah. That's
reorient,
respectable.
and we need to reorient that. I mean, I'm all for decoupling. We should. I don't believe in extreme in economic engagement with potential or actual adversaries, and even ones that allegedly are allies. And to me, Saudi Arabia is very untrustworthy. I mean, they threatened to sell off debt. If Obama, back in 2016, Obama threatened to investigate their role in 9/11 in Saudi Arabia, was like, ha
They've
ha,
been cutting production because they want Trump to win next year. Yeah.
so, you look at that and I say, well, these are countries that really we should have never, in retrospect, engaged with. And we're going to have to figure out creative ways to slowly move away. And one of the ways we have to do that is reconfigure capitalism away from this neoliberal, Reaganite, globalist, Tea Party, Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was one of the founding fathers of this whole idea of shareholder primacy. And I'm
Hmm.
sorry, but Milton Friedman, to all those people that don't like communism, well, Milton Friedman said that China 20 years ago had increasing political and personal freedoms in China. And you can challenge me. I'll read the quote and find it in my notes from my upcoming articles that eventually I'll come out with. And then, he said that, hey, we should have, the lifting the grain embargo in the Soviet Union was a good thing back in 79 or 81 when Reagan did it. And he opposed Carter's grain embargo, which the grain was diverted to the Red Army and the KGB. And he also called for, in order to help lessen the trade deficit, which he never really had a problem with.
Uh-huh.
Milton Friedman said we should lift our deregulate export controls on the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union during the 1980s. And I could list on and on.
And we have differences on our level of hawkishness towards trade. I would like to see decoupling, but you're a bit more radical than I am. But one thing I did want to say, and this is kind of bringing things full circle, might surprise a lot of listeners. I stated that yeah, my more left of center tradition was based on an understanding that helping the common man is what's really best for society. You can come at that from a conservative point of view as well. And
Mhm.
I do that all the time. I don't, yeah, you said that before. I don't really even, consider myself to be a liberal or progressive or anything like that. I have my own views that are, a little bit all over the place. And I definitely have my sympathies towards conservatism. But going back to that, what
Mhm.
does it mean to be a conservative? Do you want to conserve the wealth of oligarchs, like you said, or do you want to conserve the integrity of the American people, families, um, worker flourishing? All of this depends.
Yeah, I mean, I want all of the above. I mean, to be honest with you, now when it comes to decoupling, I don't think it's realistic to do it overnight. As I said earlier,
Mhm.
it's just not. It's not economically
Yeah.
viable. And we have to change the superstructure, the DNA of this system. And once we do that, reprogram the computer of capitalism away from the short-term shareholder value uber alles model, then we're going to be able to make progress. Then we're going to be able to push forward, and everybody in the Congress and the various concerned departments, intelligence agencies, military, once we reconfigure, we achieve a new Washington consensus, we have a new political establishment, then we can move forward. But until then, we won't be able to do that. And, to me, I agree with tariffs, but tariffs are the tip of the iceberg. There needs to be much deeper reforms to get the
Absolutely. And libertarians are even correct that tariffs can be counterproductive. I mean, I do have this point of view, and a lot of what we can leave this for have put this up for another discussion because it's definitely true of my views on foreign policy, unintended consequences. And like I said, libertarians are not wrong about everything, and it's certainly a point of view that needs to be reckoned with, just not fetishized. Yeah, tariffs, if they're not used correctly, can lead to negative outcomes. And sure enough, yeah, it has been argued that Trump's tariffs increase prices that have been kept now under Biden. At the same time, yeah, we have seen a reduction to our trade deficit. And actually, you ask farmers, for instance, who have seen prices go up for some of their supplies, they still back it. They see the value, the broader long-term value in punishing, a country that was long seen as what was the term that it was used in the IC, the intelligence community, like a strategic partner to now a strategic rival.
Yes.
So
yes. I know. I love the kind of Orwellian play on words here. Yes. Yeah. I mean, and we'll talk
but they
about.
also Orwellianly turn on a dime. So
They do. It's incredible. And and we'll talk about foreign policy, of course, in probably the third segment as we talked about off air, and we'll, talk more about these subjects that we went over. But
yeah, this will be good for another time. I actually support engagement and think that Vietnam is a strategic ally for us. Maybe not ally, but it's certainly someone we want to have on our side against China.
Yeah, and that is actually the conventional wisdom, and it has been since at least the Obama administration. I kind of have a different view on that, I venture to say, and go read my notes and whatnot. I get the logic behind that, of course, but we can talk about foreign policy. I think we said in our third segment we were going to talk about realignment, then we'll talk about the Republican presidential candidate's second one. But I think, and I'll let you have the last words. I'll say my piece in closing. I think the conversations we've had offline, and the conversation in this interview, I think this is really indicative of a mini realignment. It's like you're reaching out and I'm reaching out, and you and I come from different political traditions. But I see that there's a lot of common overlap. And even though we might disagree, like when we had the conversation offline about Ukraine, and when I gave you kind of the chance, in my opinion, to elaborate your view. I threw the questions. I said, how would you handle it? And I hate to put you people on the spot because these are very complicated issues, but you gave an answer that I can kind of swallow as a supporter of Ukraine. I will say for the audience, I'm not for sending U.S. troops, no fly zones,
Thank God.
I mean,
Absolutely.
and we can have that discussion another time because, we got to wrap up, of course, but it shows, I don't want to say that, we can have a positive back and forth because I think in a general sense, our goals are more similar than dissimilar. We might disagree on, okay, whether Cuba and Venezuela had their nationals as secret agents fomenting anti-neoliberal riots and shit. But we might disagree. But we agree on the fundamental solution to neutralize any of those.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
And to me, that's more important. You and I, we can fight about it. We were in the White House and you were president or I were president, blah, 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 everything else. But we agree with the common solution, the common medicine, the common surgery to get rid of these problems. And I think these conversations are helpful. And I look forward to having you back on the show, like Jeff Nyquist and others. I would like to have you on potentially as a semi-regular guest because
absolutely, and I enjoy our conversations. Yeah, and this is just my advice to everyone. Civility and respect really are key, and I hate that that's fetishized so much by centrist squishes. But what I've found is that normal people are good, decent human beings with respectable views that come to them through good and sound reasoning. And what you find out is that the average person actually doesn't hate you, no matter on what side of the aisle they might be. And most of the time, it's really what different media outlets have led them to believe. But when you sit down across from someone, if you don't talk about politics, and even when you do talk about politics, you'll find out that your average American, wherever they may be, has similar values and similar views on a lot.
Yeah, and I think there's correct, and I think it makes these conversations possible. And we might not stray upon certain core values, certain core beliefs on certain issues, like let's say Ukraine. But I mean, look, I bought into the notion that Russia became democratic in, after December of 1991. But then when I saw evidence and I saw enough of it, I'm like, and I just fully accept it by reading Major Anatoly Golitsyn's book, New Lies for Old. He was a KGB director. I then looked for corroborating evidence. And I'm like, this begs more questions than answers to say maybe there's stuff going on behind the curtains in Russia that we need to pay attention to. And China.
That'll have to be a talk for another time, but a good one.
Absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. And sometimes you just got to incorporate all different points of view and try, and you might not deviate from your goal and your core opinion, but you can then say, maybe we should try a different approach to handling that problem. And
yeah, absolutely.
And now I wanted to leave it to you. Where can people, any closing comments, as well as also where can people find your work?
Yeah, you can find me. I'm a columnist at Compact Magazine, so at least once a month I'll have content out on that. I officially cover Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula. So I recently published an article on the election in Argentina a week or two ago. And we'll have another one coming out potentially on Spain. I've also written for American Affairs, the American Conservative, NACLA, which is this progressive outlet that covers Latin America, and America's Quarterly, that's also specializes on Latin America content.
Excellent, very good. Well, thank you so much. A little side note: love the artwork of Kentucky on your. I guess.
Thank you.
Inside, I love it. My daughter, she goes to Savannah College of Art and Design. It's her first year, came back home. So I always admire very talented artists. Me.
Excellent. My fiance is from Kentucky.
Oh, yeah, cool. Yeah, very cool. You were telling me that. Well, tell her great job. And I enjoyed looking at her artwork over there. It definitely caught my eye.
Great. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us for this program. Thank you, Juan, for joining us. I look forward to many good conversations, little mini but friendly debates and discussions. And thank you all. Be safe. Enjoy the rest of your week. God bless, and let's pray for a better country. Thank you all very much for joining us.